Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show for a St Andrew's Day special, as Scots and indeed much of the rest of the planet looks forward to celebrating our National Day on the 30th of November. For an insight into the state of Scotland, we turn to a new book, Nations and Nationalisms, being published on this St Andrew's Day from American historian Owen Dudley Edwards, an Irish academic who has spent his entire working life in his adopted country of Scotland. But first, to a tweet, emails and messages in response to our show last week featuring England footballer John Barnes and his challenging views on the source of racism in society. Louise Hogg says, economic and class inequality, as he points out, is as much the problem as racism, but not something the likes of the media will ever want to address. William Nicholl says, good on you, John Barnes. Racism is purely ignorance in my book. We've all been involved in one way or another. Brilliant show again, the Alex Salmond team. Gordon McKenzie says, Mr. Barnes at his most eloquent, passionate but measured, a thought-provoking episode. And finally, Duncan Macquarie said, he's right. You can't have a colonial history without racism. Whether you've moved on is the key issue. And to kick racism out of sport or anywhere else, you have to kick racists out of sport. And that's not happening. Stand Scotland where it did? Asks Macduff in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Clearly not, is the emphatic answer in Owen Dudley Edwards' new book, which charts how Scottish nationality has refused to be absorbed into a greater British project, and for the last generation has found its metre not just in cultural and institutional expression, but in the form of direct political challenge. Today, he talks to Alex about Scotland's past, present, and where this is all taking us to in the future.
Owen Dudley Edwards, thank you so much for joining me in this special St Andrew's Day edition.
Alex, it is a wonderful honour for me to be on this show with you. You have been one of the greatest men of our time, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, you should keep talking like that. This interview is going to go very well indeed. Now, this book, Nations and Nationalisms, which I've read because you were kind enough to ask me to do the preface, which I was proud to do. It's a book about all four nations, Scotland, England, Wales and Ireland, all the nations of these islands. Would that be correct?
Yes, certainly. And also, of course, it's looking at faraway influences on them from the Old and New Testaments, from Homer and what people picked up from him, from Virgil and from Shakespeare and James VI and First. All of them people making some vital contribution, but not telling the whole story by any means.
But what about the elephant in the room, or the elephant in the bed, we might say, quoting Pierre Trudeau? English nationalism or British nationalism? What's the genesis of that?
Well, as far as that is concerned, we don't understand nationalism unless we realise that everybody is a nationalist. And so a great deal of the story of nationalism in these islands has been various different forms of nationalism in the different countries. English nationalism began partly by being a victim of the peripheries, raiding parties from Scotland, from Ireland, as well as from the European continent, breaking up the Britain that existed at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. And then in the later stage, it's more a strengthening England, moving in different ways and in different respects on the peripheral countries, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, the only one of the three which wasn't conquered by England. But of course, all these nationalisms borrow from each other. And English nationalism, as, for example, you could find it in various of the plays of Shakespeare. You can't say Shakespeare believes this, but he can make some of his characters appear to believe it. And the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots borrowed from what they could get from Shakespeare and from various other writers, and whether the English like it or not, vice versa.
But Shakespeare's an interesting example, isn't he? Because his early plays during the reign of Elizabeth I was very much exemplifying and heralding English nationalism. Plucky England withstanding the Spanish Armada, But his later plays, after the ascension of James VI and First, were very much trying to cooperate with the new king in producing a British nationalism. Would that be an accurate description?
Yes, I think very much. And James VI and First, having become king of England in 1603, after having been a cradle king from 1566-67, James desperately wanted to make the English and the Scots one nation with a united parliament. The Scots might have been ready to take it, but the English weren't. And so James, desperately trying to make the English think that a union of parliaments as well as a union of crowns embodied in himself would make Great Britain. And in fact, he was the first to declare himself King of Great Britain, and he did the declaring, didn't wait for anybody else. So the year after he became king in 1604, the year after his accession. Now, Shakespeare, as far as I can see, becomes involved. One of the first things James did was to declare that the Chancellor, the Chamberlain's company, which Shakespeare and his fellow actors played in, was now to become the King's company. And for Shakespeare wanted to have a Scottish play, and he needed desperately Scottish advice. And James, I think, had a major part to do with it. In all sorts of ways, the play is very well informed about Scotland, but also the play heats up again old mythologies. So the play Macbeth actually bases itself on very unfair things about the King Macbeth, who ruled for 17 years and apparently was a very good king from 1040 to 1057. But he became the monster who fell through ambition and treachery in Shakespeare's play. And that play ends with the English coming in to rescue the Scots from cruel Macbeth. And from that point of view, ideal from James's point of view for propaganda.
I thought you were going to follow the very best theatrical tradition and not mention the name of the Scottish play. But is your thesis, Owen Dudley Edwards, that there was a conscious effort by James the Sixth and First, certainly the best read monarch in Christendom, and arguably the greatest playwright in history, William Shakespeare, to create a British identity? Are you arguing there was a conscious effort by them working in cahoots to create that British identity?
Very much. They were working together to get this idea of wanting Great Britain. Shakespeare starts using the word Britain and British much more than he ever had. And the story of Macbeth also shows things like a benevolent figure of an English king, doesn't come on stage, but an English king who might be rather like James, Edward the Confessor. But at the same time, of course, James was also doing other things to consolidate, and one of them being his insistence on the creation of the great Bible, the King James Bible, drawing in a whole series of theologians, translators, to produce a book which would be everybody. So he wants to dominate religion, he wants to dominate literature, culture, philosophy.
And of course, one of the other monarchical projects of James I was the Union Jack, originally a naval flag, which he organised a design competition for, and then became the Union flag, adapted after the Union of Ireland, obviously. So he was interested in symbolism. I mean, do you see some parallels between the activities of James I and William Shakespeare and, well, let's say, Boris Johnson and the BBC?
Well, there are some very remarkable figures in the BBC, but I suspect that they are being more and more pressured to conform to a much cruder kind of nationalism. Boris Johnson himself has some little learning, I gather, in classics, which he studied at the university, but he wears what learning he has, as you might say, very lightly. He produced one of the worst books on Winston Churchill which has ever come out. And apparently people are supposed to be imagining him as being like Churchill. He doesn't know Scotland and seems almost to run away from having to see too much of it. In this way, he's a bit unlike his predecessor, David Cameron. On the night of the referendum in 2014 as to whether Scotland would be independent or not, David Cameron made much about the fact that his small son was wearing tartan underpants. Now, that's not, shall we say, a very profound insight on Scotland, but it was at least some sort of token reference. And so would Cameron's assumptions about his own remote Scottish ancestry. That's not present in Johnson's case. And to a certain extent, Johnson is rather like a schoolboy. People think of him as a public schoolboy, learn off a little bit of a lesson, but not very much of it, and hopes he can get by with it.
Now, if this project, the Great British Project, let's call it that, has been going on for 400 years, I mean, what's happened? I mean, we have Scottish nationalism politically resurgent. We have Ireland probably closer to unification than it's been for some 100 years and more. And Wales, at least in a language and literary sense, where nationalism is still very, very evident indeed. So why didn't the Great British Project of 400 years ago work?
Well, for a variety of reasons, and one of the most obvious ones was class. That the English were conscious of being the more superior civilization, technologically much more advanced, but also, of course, very much anxious to seize good land in Ireland, which they did. The Long Parliament at the time of the Civil War has been one of the areas this was done. Cromwell confiscated a lot of Ireland for his veterans and so forth. Scotland being independent until James himself became the king in 1603, but after a certain length of time, the Scottish nobles and great landowners anglified themselves, became much more English. So class was all over the place in that sense. And class became the means by which the different nationalities protesting against what was happening to them came to identify themselves, since these were the losers in that arrangement.
So, Owen Dudley Edwards, are you arguing that the sense of Scottish identity was kept alive by the working classes of Scotland, but perhaps like the 1820 rising and the 1820 martyrs? In Ireland, the great land claims and campaigns of a whole variety of the towering figures of Irish nationalism. And in Wales, through the miners and through the exemplifiers of socialism, like Keir Hardie and others. Is that your argument, that the sense of identity was kept alive in the working classes, whereas the upper classes would have been quite happy to fling their lot in with the Great British Project?
Well, you have to think really about the working classes' response being what was heard from them. And that's where in Scotland, for instance, Robert Burns, learning so much from his fellow workers, small farmers and so forth, and giving their culture immortality. So many of Burns's songs, the ones he collected, as well as the ones which he created. Burns gave, as it were, Scottish nationalism an identity in song before we started looking at careful theory or anything like that. Even stranger, Walter Scott, who was a Tory in politics, certainly right-wing, but on the other hand, he did so much to learn as much as he possibly could of the dying culture of the lower classes and immortalized them. He became the father of social history across the world, apart from anything else, looking at people instead of merely looking at successful barons or successful technology, whatever. And in Wales, of course, one of the effects of Welsh would be to make the Welsh a more democratic people, to think much more in ordinary terms, because, of course, to know the language which was in danger became a great matter of nationalism itself. English was important, and so many of the Welsh actually did terribly well in English, but the preservation of Welsh became absolutely key. And that cultural identity stands to them in a way. They were far more successful in preserving their different nationalisms than Ireland, or their different national languages than Ireland or Scotland.
And when we come back in a few minutes, we're going to look precisely at the contrasting paths of Irish and Scottish nationalism, and perhaps take you out your field into having a wee look at the future instead of the history.
Welcome back. As the Scottish nation approaches its National Day, Alex interviews historian Owen Dudley Edwards about his new book entitled Nations and Nationalisms.
Owen Dudley Edwards, you're an Irishman yourself, happily settled in Scotland for the last half century or so. The different paths of Irish and Scottish nationalism, what's the essence of that explanation?
Well, one of them is that because Scotland wasn't a conquered country, it had to be more obviously recognised as, at least in theory, playing a partnership in the rule of these islands. This comes out very obviously when after 1745, when Bonnie Prince Charlie made his attempt, which came closer perhaps to success than many people realize. But after that, naturally, the Highlanders who had followed him were savagely treated at the time, and there was a great deal of land confiscation. But within 10 years, they were recruiting the Highlanders to fight in the 7 Years' War. Now, because Catholicism, the main religion in Ireland, was the preservation of support for the Stuarts there, and because the Catholics had originally owned the land which had been so recently confiscated, that meant that Catholics were kept out of the UK Army or the British Army, and it meant that, in a sense, there was a sense of degradation of not being allowed to use arms in that way. So that in the 19th century, great political leaders emerged under the Act of Union because the Irish Parliament, which had banned Catholics in it anyway, because that was wiped out in 1800, with effect from 1801. In that UK Parliament in Westminster, great Irish figures arose who, in essence, taught democracy to the British and used Parliament as a means for getting concessions, and of course spoke their ideas of nationalism. But Daniel O'Connell, the great leader, was completely against violence, did what he could to prevent people even dreaming about it from times past and so forth. And again, in the latter part of the century, when the tremendously effective party led by Charles Stuart Parnell, throwing out two English governments and British governments in succession to one another in 1885 and 1886. And that creation of discipline, showing what could be got from constitutional use, meant that constitutional nationalism could teach the expansion of democracy to the English, to the Scots, to the Welsh. And they made a great achievement there. And yet the tragedy remains that in the 20th century, while the Scots and the Welsh very sensibly kept their nationalisms non-violent, and it became absolutely root and branch for the Scottish National Party when it came into being that our nationalism would never be a nationalism of violence. But in Ireland, the tragedy was that because of World War I, which drenched the world in violence, a protest movement emerged, partly in some alliance with Germany in 1916, and a very small insurrection was started, which was put down brutally by a stupid English general who had been left in charge, John Maxwell. And the result was, whereas the insurrection was very unpopular in 1916, but when the leaders were massacred without trials before there were just court-martials under the military authority and nothing told until they were already dead. And this led to a great anger emerging. So too did the fact that the rising was put down by Dublin itself being bombarded and flattened. So Dublin became one of the capitals which lay in ruins after the First World War. And that actually, I think, played quite an important part in suddenly of people saying, no, they didn't want to have anything more to do with the country which had destroyed the principal city.
And you would argue that was the seminal moment, the savagery by which the Easter Rising was put down, created the divide. See, I'm interested because in the 1918 election, Sinn Féin won a landslide victory across Ireland. But the Sinn Féin landslide in parliamentary seats for Westminster wasn't as great as the SNP landslide in Scotland in 2015, and indeed the subsequent elections where the SNPs had a majority of Westminster seats. What I'm interested in is why in 1918 did a majority of seats for Sinn Féin, eventually result in a free state and an independent republic. Whereas in Scotland, a majority of seats at Westminster hasn't resulted in any substantial constitutional progress at all over these last 6 years.
Now, the success of nationalism depends to quite an extent on the stupidity of its opponents. And as far as the future is concerned, while you might say that the Unionists have shown a great deal of stupidity and a great refusal to come to terms with the realities of a nationalist Scotland, that it's quite likely that they will make more and greater mistakes in the future, which are likely to conclude much support for the Union in Scotland.
Right, I'm going to take you out of your field now, Owen Dudley Edwards. I mean, you're a historian, a great substantial American historian, a great literary figure in these islands. But let's look at the future. Let's look at the crystal ball, and let's take the Celtic countries in turn. Let's take your native country of Ireland. Are we closer to Irish unity than at any point in the last 100 years, or are there still searing differences to be overcome across the island?
Oh, we're much closer because, I mean, one of the things which is a guarantee of some improvement is human relations changing. In fact, in the late 20th century, because the Irish in Dublin have specifically renounced an insistence that the 6 counties are theirs, therefore, they're winning many more friends and much more respect in the north from which they did. So the way in which, in fact, at the present time, the famous protocol, which is causing so much bad feeling between the UK and the EU, the way that's been handled, the protocol about trade in Northern Ireland and its trade relations with the larger island, that was agreed to, created by Boris Johnson, and he is now, in this month of November, making whatever efforts he can to try to deny it. So the notion of Northern Ireland being kicked around in this way naturally alienates it. I would say that there's not perhaps a great deal of love for the Republic, but there is much more suspicion of London. And with it, you see, the sense that, which has always been true of the Scottish nationalists as well, London really is not capable of managing Northern Ireland anymore. Yes, part of it had to survive this dreadful 30 years civil war in Northern Ireland itself. But at the present time, a peaceful time largely, the very fact that Northern Ireland itself is being used as a political football means that with them, as with the Scottish nationalists, the proof of English incompetence, that is actually much more valuable than, shall we say, a nationalist strain which kept on talking about grievances and how badly people are treated. The simple statement that the Union is no longer fit for purpose. That seems to be the case as far as Britain is concerned, and it's getting more and more like it as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. Where the unity of Ireland would be farther away would be if more attempts are made to bring it about by violence. Naturally, that would put Northern Ireland more and more on the defensive, keep it closer and closer to the existing UK, and the Republic wouldn't want to have anything to do with violence. They've learned too much what a ghastly mistake it was to have started off with it.
So, Owen Dudley Edwards, on this St Andrew's Day, what's going to happen in Scotland? With the SNP electorally dominant, but in some ways politically becalmed. I mean, their electoral success seems to count for nothing if Boris Johnson of Westminster are not going to concede another test of the independence question. What's going to happen in Scotland?
Now, in Scotland at the present time, we have the most effective leader as a leader, a first minister, in the shape of Nicola Sturgeon. But she is, as far as I can see, in the politics of firm equanimity, that there is a consensus that would seem really to mean that nationalism is being put, not into a deep freezer, but shall we say, into a cooler. And the next phase would be likely to be the absolute necessity for nationalism to assert itself with its knowledge about what Scotland means, what Scotland is. Of course, the relationship with the European Union is of overwhelming importance here. The fact that Scotland is denied its place in Europe for which it voted. With it, therefore, the less that Scottish nationalism simply appears to want to show that it's adult, grown up, and really just as grown up as they are in London, the more sense of no, we differ in culture, we differ in political intent, we differ above all in the fact that we want an egalitarian society. And that is keeping us farther from the English consensus, which is so much based upon class, a danger to any society which really knows its identity comes from equality. And that's what Scotland is, and that is what Scotland and its politicians should constantly remember. Equality should be, I think, the yardstick by which the future progress of Scottish nationalism is measured.
Owen Dudley Edwards, author, historian, and student of Celtic and nationalism throughout these islands. Thank you so much for joining me on this St Andrew's Day.
It's a great honour, and Alex, and thank you very much indeed.
When Macduff asks his famous question in Shakespeare's Macbeth about the state of Scotland, the answer comes from Ross. Alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself. As Owen Dudley Edwards reveals, the great playwright was fully engaged in a plan with his royal patron, the newly crowned King James, to forge a new British identity out of the disparate nations of these islands. 400 years later, we can conclude that this master plan was a failure, since Scottish identity is alive and kicking and now expressing itself directly and politically. However, all is not plain sailing from here to independence. The SNP may be electorally dominant, but they're also politically becalmed, with no apparent strategy for implementing their successive electoral mandates to deliver for the people a new opportunity to vote themselves to independence. As a historian, the past is Owen Dudley Edwards' specialist subject. However, understanding the past is often the key to unlocking the future. And for now, from Alex, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.